Welcome to GRE Snacks, snackable episodes about the GRE exam and graduate school admissions. I'm Tyler, the founder of Achievable. We have an affordable $199 GRE course that includes everything you need to ace your GRE. Full textbook, tons of GRE questions backed by our memory-enhancing algorithm, and full-length practice exams. You can try us out for free at achievable.me, and if you like it, the podcast will get you 10% off. And also, if you have a question or topic that you'd like us to discuss in a future episode, you can contact me at tyler@achievable.me with the subject line podcast topic. Now, let's get started. So today, and I am going to try and do this correctly, we have Erfun Guela on the show with us. Did I get that right?
Erfun Guela, but close enough. It's you were the first person to butcher it.
Man. All right. Erfun Guela. And he's the founder of GRE Compass. So do you want to just give a little intro about yourself?
Sure. First off, thanks for having me. I've been a GRE tutor for about 15 years. I scored a perfect exam on the GRE, and I'm sole author of McGraw-Hill's Guide to the GRE, which has been out since 2013 and sold about 100,000 copies. I have a lot of experience with test takers sort of across the range of scores, working with people who start at, like a 150 quant, 150 verbal, all the way up to people who are already in the 160s and are shooting for upper echelon scores.
Great.
Excited to be here.
Yeah, happy to have you on the show, and thanks for coming on. So the topic that you wanted to discuss today was common misconceptions about the GRE. So, I mean, take it away, because I feel like that could be a number of different things.
Yeah, so it's a pretty broad topic. What I had particularly in mind is sort of this idea that a lot of people go into their studying with, which is that the GRE is largely kind of a memorization-based exam, whereby if you want to do well on the quant section, you have to go relearn all the core quant content, memorize a bunch of rules. If you want to do well on text completion, you have to go memorize, every word in the dictionary, etc. Now, what I mean by the misconception here, if you've done any studying, of course, you do need to relearn the core quant content. There's really no way around having a base in, essentially high school math and, high school algebra and geometry. The big misconception there, though, is coming at the quant from the lens that it's a math section and a math test, when in reality, it's testing your quantitative reasoning ability. So the big distinction there is to understand what the test makers fundamentally are concerned with is not simply, hey, do you remember exponent rules? Do you remember, the rate time bits and formulas? But instead, can you reason flexibly within a quantitative context? And so a big sort of consequence of this misconception is when people study, they think, okay, again, right, it's just like it's a math test. When I took math tests in school, I just learned 20 formulas and just spit them out on the exam. And what they end up doing as a result is what I call pigeonholing questions. By pigeonholing questions, what I mean is students will look at a question and say, okay, this is a quote-unquote rate question, it's a quote-unquote exponents question, and then just try to approach it in a very rigid way instead of actually reasoning through the situation in a way that the test makers reward. What's important to understand, the test makers spend a lot of time and money constructing questions in such a way that reward certain skills. So it's not, I say this to somebody who has experience writing questions myself. So when people at test prep companies write questions, they might get paid $50 per question, something along those lines. When ETS writes these questions, they're spending thousands of dollars per question. That money they're spending largely goes into making sure that they're constructing them in such a way that really reflects the skills that they're concerned with. All right, so that misconception that's just simply a math exam instead of a reason, in quant in particular, instead of sort of a reasoning section is really important. That also manifests itself in quant comparison in particular. One thing I find there very often is, students don't really modify their approach. They'll go to quant comparison, think it's very similar to discrete quant, like your standard multiple choice questions, and they'll, just again, try to just do a bunch of math, a bunch of calculations, etc. When in reality, these questions are constructed to take around 90 seconds. So they should actually take a lot less time than your standard multiple choice questions. And if you don't come at them from the right reasoning angle using the proper framework, then they're going to take longer. You're going to introduce inefficiencies, and then, things just sort of cascade negatively from there. So
yeah, I was going to say that's something that we talked about actually earlier in sort of our season of the podcast with Charles. Was what he calls engineer's disease, but it's just the idea that in quant, it's like, I know how to solve this.
Uh-huh.
yes, but do you know how to solve it in 90 seconds, right? Like, and
Right.
usually there's some other method that's not just like directly solving the problem with math that is what the test taker envisioned you solving it with, right? Like they envisioned you using some kind of like either reasoning or logical trick to like figure out the answer in much less time.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the idea is if you have choices, they're there for a reason. I mean, they are available to give you alternate strategies to get to the goal, and a lot of people simply don't leverage that. I mean, a lot of times when I start working with somebody, I'll notice, I'll give them a few questions, and just a very basic question. I'll ask them, "Hey, did you look at the choices?" And very often the answer is no. They just come at it from the angle of, "Okay, like this is a test." Like what I took in high school, where I have to show my work, how I got to the answer, etc. Well, no, all that matters is just essentially circle the correct answer. Now, it is worth noting, ETS, of course, they do construct questions to reward, a sort of flexible mindset, all to being able to identify and take different approaches toward questions. At the same time, sometimes, they really do want to see, like, put you in a position where you're going to have to exercise some pretty strong quant muscles. They do that with numeric entry, in my opinion, right? Numeric entry, there aren't choices. A lot of times you are going to be forced to you still have to be flexible and efficient, but in the absence of choices, things will become more inherently more challenging. There are situations where sometimes, having that stronger quant foundation is rewarded. But yeah, the way
Mm-hmm.
Charles, like you said, Brandon, you said engineer's disease.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I think that's a good way of conceptualizing it for sure. Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of times, I will get people who have a strong base in the math, and it actually does more harm than good because they're used to just finding the sort of brute force approach to getting to the answer when that's not really the best way of going about it. It's actually,
Right.
it does bring up it's sort of important distinction that I like to emphasize to students, which is what I call top-down thinking versus bottom-up thinking. And we can think of
Okay.
bottom-up thinking. I mean, right? You do a lot of computer programming, so right? Bottom-up thinking is essentially what computers do, where they'll just like do trial and error, arrive at the proper solution. Whereas top-down thinking is being goal-oriented, you're sort of using executive functioning, letting the goal dictate the subsequent steps you take. And for so many people, they're just accustomed to bottom-up thinking that they'll see a math question, they'll just start doing trial and error. Let me do this, let me do that, see what happens, and that's when you start introducing inefficiencies. And that's one of the biggest sort of shifts in mindset that, in my opinion, is required to maximize your efficiency on the quant questions.
Yeah, very cool. And also, I mean, that's such a good example of bottom up versus top down. Because, I mean, bottom up, for instance, like computers are fantastic at chess because it's just bottom up. It's like you have this situation, there's, I don't know, 27 million different things that could happen from here on out. Like, figure out the best one. Versus,
Right.
like, self driving cars are still, I remember in 2015, self driving cars were coming out by 2018 and it's 2022 and they are not really self driving. It's a
Right.
lot
Exactly.
of the top down is a lot harder.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
For computers,
So
right? But that's where I mean, like that's what humans won't be replaced by computers anytime soon necessarily in that capacity of being able to use executive functioning in that way. So like that's a skill that we all reward for, the skill that the exam does reward as well.
yeah, and a skill the exam targets for sure.
Yeah.
So that's the first misconception. What's your second one?
Yeah, so talking about verbal, the big misconception there is with text completion sentence equivalence in particular, thinking that it's largely a matter of vocabulary. So to expand on that, basically, the you know I imagine most of the people listening to this podcast are maybe not be aware of this, but the GRE did change in 2011. In 2011, it had some different question types, different scoring, etc. One really important shift: they removed analogies and antonyms from the exam. So prior to 2011, there were antonyms and analogies, and the idea is basically if you really want to just measure somebody's vocabulary ability in the absence of saying, write out a definition, the best way of doing so is antonyms, right? Because with antonyms,
Mm-hmm.
like, okay, like either you know the word or you don't. If you don't know the word, you're not going to be able to find an antonym. There's no way around that. So there was a point at which, yes, they were explicitly concerned on some level solely with your base and academic vocabulary. But they did change the two question types, right? So now we have text between sentence equivalents. And what's really important to emphasize with these questions is why did they make the change? Right? They made the change because they realized, well, look, this brute vocab knowledge is only important to a certain extent, right? Ultimately, of course, we all have dictionaries, etc. What they care more about is your ability to exercise close contextual reading and to be able to infer the author's intended meaning within a text. So the
Mm-hmm.
point there being, a lot of people will come at these the quote unquote vocab questions from the angle of, okay, let me go memorize, the 2,000 most commonly tested words, and I'll be good to go. And in doing so, they neglect ever developing a good methodology and how to actually approach the sentences. So very often, what I'll see is somebody will have memorized all the words, but will do it even like relatively straightforward text completion question and a lot of difficulty because they don't actually know how to decipher the sentence. So the real
Mm-hmm.
idea here is, okay, yes, if you don't have a good base in academic vocabulary, you do want to beef that up. That's inarguable, but that's not going to be necessary and sufficient to see a good score on test science equivalent. More important, you need to make sure that you're deciphering the sentence correctly. That again, think about things from the perspective of the test makers. They
Mm-hmm.
write these sentences in a way that they're logically decipherable, that you could identify words that create logical relationships and consequently sort of deconstruct the sentence or the paragraph accordingly. They construct in such a way you want to make sure that you're able to look at the sentences from that framework. If you're not doing that, you can know all the vocab in the world. It's not going to make a difference. You're going to fall for a lot of traps. So
Mm-hmm.
where people allocate their time in terms of studying for these question types, I think that's a consequence of the conception that it is largely a matter of vocabulary. And sort of also an extension of that, in my opinion, studying these vocab lists is also of limited use. I mean, it's helpful, but there is no, like, ETS doesn't publish a list of 1,000 words, right? Like, where do these words come from? We all develop them just based off of previously published materials. And, it's useful to some
Right.
extent, right?
Yeah, it is useful, but it's also, you're learning words that actually don't often get used in the real world. And,
Right.
as much as it's nice to know what didactic means, like I don't actually think I'm ever going to put that in an email, right? And
Right.
I work in, I'm in tech technically. And worked in tech in the past, and I've never seen language like that, right? Like there is sort of I think for me it's like, obviously, like not everything you study for on the GRE is going to be used in real life, and that's fine. That's part of the thing. But it's more, I think you'll get more mileage out of learning how to break apart sentences
Exactly.
than you
Exactly.
would from
Yeah.
vocab.
Yeah, exactly. And right, that touches on, just the importance of when you're studying, making sure you're doing so in a way that's generalizable, right? So instead of trying to say,
Mm-hmm.
okay, let me go like memorize this random word, that random word, hope it shows up on the exam. Well, okay, what about this overall sentence could have positioned me to get to the right answer even had I not known every single word, right? And developing that ability will serve you a lot better on the real thing. I also, going back to, I mean, this is partly misconceptions, but I guess we're going to some other territory here. But I do think it's important when it comes to trying to develop that basic academic vocabulary. I suggest that students do academic reading. So what I really suggest is, if you heard the New York Review of Books, it's just
Mm-hmm.
it's a periodical that does like where academics write reviews of academic books, and it's very similar in tone, style, vocabulary to what's on the real thing. And what I tell students, read a couple articles from there every day, memorize the words you don't know. That'll serve you in a lot of ways a lot better than just an out of context memorizing random words.
Right. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense, and it gets you used to reading these like academic style
Uh huh.
paragraphs, which is helpful for reading comp, especially.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, definitely. I mean, the reading comp is, I think, it's pretty tough on the GRE. I mean, I do GRE and GMAT. I find the GRE reading comp for most people is tougher. I mean, a lot of it is from the humanities, which many people, especially if you're like applying to quant oriented programs, you would not be as familiar with or have as much exposure to. So, periodical publication like that could help a lot in getting you just more acclimated to that kind of writing.
Yeah, very cool. Do you have any other misconceptions you want to talk about today?
We're going to touch on this, I think, later. But I do, one other high level misconception is it's sort of a logical fallacy of equating the perceived difficulty of a topic with its importance. So, in other words, a
Hmm.
lot of times when people get into their studying, they'll notice, oh, wait a minute, I'm having a lot of trouble on probability. I'm having a lot of trouble on rates. Let me go devote all my time to those topics. I want to make sure I really master those. But the fact is, yes, they might stand out disproportionately in your mind, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're tested that heavily. So it's really, this
Mm-hmm.
misconception that it seems difficult, therefore it's important. When the reality is, a lot of the basics, I mean, like core arithmetic, core algebra matter a lot more. Developing a good, strong foundation
Right.
there will go a lot further in getting to a high score than, spending 20 or 30 hours memorizing every possible variation of combinatorics you might see on the exam.
Yeah, exactly. That makes a ton of sense. Well, thanks. This has been GRE Snacks, hosted by Tyler from Achievable. You can try Achievable's GRE course for free at achievable.me, and the code podcast gets you 10% off at checkout.